Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the shadowy corners of human history that your high school teachers definitely skipped over. The places where pain wasn't just an accident, but an art form refined over centuries. And fair warning, you probably won't make it through these next 30 minutes without questioning what exactly our species is capable of when empathy takes a holiday. So before you drift off completely, like this video and subscribe, only if this kind of sleepy narration is your thing. And hey, drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is on your end. Now kill the overhead lights, maybe light a candle, and let's get into some history. The story of torture begins, as most terrible human innovations do, with power. In the cradle of civilization, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the ancient Mesopotamians weren't just inventing writing and mathematics. They were pioneering the systematic application of suffering. Around 2300 BCE, Akkadian kings discovered something fascinating. Physical pain could be more than just punishment. It could be theater, a spectacle, a message sent not just to the victim, but to anyone thinking of challenging authority. Imagine yourself in ancient Babylon, the sun beating down mercilessly on your already sunburnt shoulders. You've been dragged to the city center, where a small crowd has gathered. Nobody wants to be there, but attendance is strongly encouraged. The Babylonian method of flaying, the careful removal of skin while keeping the victim alive, wasn't just about causing pain. It was about transformation, turning a person into an object. A warning. The Code of Hammurabi, which you might know for its eye for an eye justice, was considerably more creative than that simple phrase suggests. If you built a house that collapsed and killed the owner, you wouldn't just be executed, you'd be executed in a manner matching the suffering you caused. Poetic justice, if poetry were written in screams. Egyptian pharaohs, meanwhile, took a more refined approach. Rather than the brute force favored by their Mesopotamian neighbors, they preferred techniques like the reed stacks. You'd be tied between two mats of woven reeds, with only your head exposed. Then they'd pour honey on your face, attracting insects that would slowly consume the exposed parts, while you were force-fed milk and honey to keep you alive, and productive at both ends. The resulting bodily functions had nowhere to go but inside the reed mats, creating an ecosystem of insects and worse, that would consume you from the outside in. The process could take weeks. The Egyptians were nothing if not patient. It's worth noting, and scholars actually debate this point quite vigorously, that torture in these early civilizations wasn't always about information extraction. Unlike the later European methods we'll discuss, ancient torture was primarily about punishment and deterrence. Though I suppose if you were the poor soul being lowered into a Persian Judas cradle, the academic distinction probably offered little comfort. Speaking of Persia, the Achaemenid Empire elevated torture to a level of creativity that would make even the most hardened modern horror director wince. The infamous boats method involved feeding the victim milk and honey until they developed severe diarrhea, then placing them in two boats fitted together with their head, hands, and feet protruding. More honey would be applied to these extremities, attracting insects. Left to float in a stagnant pond, the victim would slowly be eaten alive, while their own excrement bred maggots inside the boat. Some historical accounts suggest victims could survive for weeks this way, though honestly, by day 3, survival probably felt like the worst possible outcome. You might be wondering how we know these details. Unlike modern governments that tend to hide their torture programs, ancient civilizations documented their methods with pride. Stone carvings from Assyria show detailed scenes of impalement, with victims displayed as trophies. Royal records from Darius, the Great's reign, include itemized expenses for torture equipment. History's first bureaucrats made sure every thumbscrew was accounted for. The ancient Assyrians, ruling northern Mesopotamia around 900 BCE, preferred a particularly theatrical approach. They would often flay their victims and then stretch the skin over drums. Yes, actual drums. Imagine being at an Assyrian military parade and realizing the percussion section was made from yesterday's political prisoners, and you thought your workplace had toxic management. Not to be outdone, the ancient Chinese developed the 5 tortures during the Xia dynasty: tattooing the face, cutting off the nose, cutting off the feet, castration, and death. Though honestly, by the time they got to the 5th one, it probably felt like a mercy. These punishments evolved over centuries, becoming more refined under subsequent dynasties. The Chinese approach was notable for its bureaucratization. Specific crimes warranted specific tortures, all codified in law. There was a procedure, a process. Pain, but make it administrative. What's particularly fascinating about ancient torture is how it reflects the technological capabilities of each society. The Egyptians used their knowledge of insects and decay. The Mesopotamians applied their architectural skills to create specialized torture chambers. The Persians, with their advanced knowledge of human anatomy, knew exactly which points of the body could endure the most pain without causing death. Torture, in its terrible way, was a showcase for a civilization's achievements. One of the lesser-known aspects of ancient torture was its connection to medicine. The same knowledge that could heal could also harm with frightening precision. Egyptian physician priests who understood how to treat illness also understood how to prolong suffering. In some kingdoms, medical schools doubled as training grounds for royal torturers, both professions requiring intimate knowledge of human anatomy and physiology. As civilizations grew more sophisticated, so too did their methods of causing pain. By the time we reach the classical world of Greece and Rome, torture had evolved from simple brutality to something approaching a science. The ancient world may have pioneered torture, but it took the classical civilizations, those supposed bastions of democracy, philosophy, and reasoned thought, to truly institutionalize it. Welcome to Greece and Rome, where Socrates pondered ethics, while slaves were methodically broken one joint at a time in the basement. Athens, that shining cradle of democracy that we so love to romanticize, had a rather uncomfortable relationship with torture. They called it basanos, originally referring to a touchstone used to test gold, later applied to the process of testing truth through pain. The fascinating contradiction here is that Athenian citizens were legally protected from torture. It was considered unreliable for free men who might say anything under duress. Slaves, however, different story entirely. Greek legal proceedings regularly involved the torture of slaves to extract testimony. The logic was beautifully twisted. Slaves couldn't be trusted to tell the truth unless they were being tortured. Pain, in the Greek mind, was the great equalizer, the one thing that could make a slave's word hold weight in court. There's a certain dark poetry in that, isn't there? The same civilization that gave us Aristotle's ethics also gave us the wheel, not the transportation kind, but the kind your limbs were strapped to before being slowly dislocated. Picture yourself in a small Athenian courtroom. The floor is cool marble beneath your sandaled feet. Light streams in through high windows, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air. The case seems simple enough, a theft from a merchant's home. But then the prosecutor motions to the back of the room, where a terrified household slave is brought forward. This man saw everything, he announces, and he will tell us the truth, once properly questioned. The Greeks had rules for this, of course. The slave's owner had to consent to the torture. It was property damage, after all. Any permanent injury would require compensation. Records show owners sometimes volunteering their slaves for torture just to prove their confidence in their case. That's how certain I am of my innocence. They'd essentially say, I'll let you break my valuable human property to prove it. Talk about putting your money where your mouth is. But it was the Romans who truly elevated torture from occasional necessity to administrative routine. The Romans were nothing if not efficient, and they approached pain with the same systematic mindset they applied to road building and aqueduct construction. They even had a dedicated torture chamber called the Carnificina in every major town, usually located near the prison and courthouse. Very convenient for all your interrogation needs. Roman torture methods were diverse, but they particularly favored the equilius, or little horse, a wooden frame that slowly stretched the victim's body until joints separated. Think of it as very, very aggressive chiropractic care. They also popularized strapado, where the victim's hands were tied behind their back and they were hoisted by a rope attached to their wrists, resulting in dislocation of the shoulders. If that wasn't painful enough, weights could be added to the feet. Innovation. What's interesting about Roman torture is how bureaucratized it became. There were official torturers, questionarii, on the government payroll. There were manuals detailing which techniques to use for which crimes. There were even regulations about who could be tortured. Roman citizens were generally exempt, at least until the later empire, when citizenship became more widespread and thus less special. Crucifixion, perhaps the most infamous Roman torture method, wasn't just about nailing someone to a cross and waiting. That would be far too simple. No, the Romans understood that crucifixion was theater, and like any good show, pacing was everything. Before the main event, victims were typically flogged with a flagrum, a whip embedded with bone, and metal pieces designed to tear flesh from muscle. By the time you reached the cross, you were already in shock, your back essentially flayed open. The position on the cross itself was ingeniously cruel. Your arms, stretched outward and upward, would slowly suffocate you as your diaphragm failed. To take a breath, you'd need to push up with your feet, driving the nails further into them and sending fresh waves of agony through your body. The choice became breathe and suffer, or relax and suffocate. Some victims lasted days in this terrible dance between pain and asphyxiation. One detail that historians still debate is whether the nails went through the palms or the wrists. Anatomically, nails through the palms couldn't support body weight. The flesh would tear. More likely, they went through the wrists, between the radius and ulna bones, though some evidence suggests they sometimes tied the arms with rope first, then added nails as a decorative, painful touch. Because if you're going to publicly execute someone, why not add some flair? Speaking of public spectacle, both Greeks and Romans understood that torture wasn't just about the victim, it was about the audience. Pain as performance. The Greeks preferred their torture behind closed doors, part of legal proceedings, witnessed only by relevant parties. The Romans, they filled amphitheaters to watch. The morning's entertainment might include watching criminals being torn apart by wild animals or burned alive while dressed as characters from mythology. Imagine the cognitive dissonance of watching a man being eaten by a lion while dressed as Hercules, the great hero who slew the Nemean lion. Roman irony had teeth. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of classical torture was its intellectual justification. These weren't primitive societies acting on base instincts. These were civilizations with complex philosophies, legal systems, and ethical debates. Cicero, Seneca, and other Roman philosophers wrote extensively about justice and mercy, sometimes in the same scrolls where they defended certain torture practices as necessary. They had reasons, arguments, justifications, all laid out with impeccable logic. The Romans also innovated in psychological torture. Simnia, a form of mock execution where the victim believed they were about to die, was used to break resistance before physical torture even began. They understood that fear of pain could be as effective as pain itself. The anticipation of suffering creates its own special kind of hell. As the Roman Empire began its long, slow collapse, torture methods became more desperate and creative. The security apparatus of a dying empire rarely goes gentle into that good night. But as Rome fell, its torture techniques were preserved and adapted by those who came next, particularly the emerging power of the Christian Church, because nothing says, "Love thy neighbor," quite like carrying on the tradition of systematic suffering. As the Western world stumbled through its dark ages, the East was experiencing anything but darkness when it came to the refinement of human suffering. From the mountainous kingdoms of ancient China to the isolated islands of feudal Japan, Eastern civilizations approached torture with the same meticulous attention to detail that characterized their art, architecture, and philosophy. These weren't just methods of causing pain. They were elaborate rituals, carefully designed to maximize suffering, while often keeping victims alive for remarkably extended periods. Remember the brief mention of Chinese tortures in our first chapter? Well, those early foundations evolved into something far more sophisticated under the Tang, Song, and Ming dynasties. Perhaps no method illustrates this evolution better than Ling Chai, often translated euphemistically as death by 1,000 cuts, or more literally as slow slicing. First officially codified during the Song dynasty around 900 CE, Ling Chai wasn't just about causing pain. It was about prolonging it through precise anatomical knowledge. Imagine yourself in imperial Beijing, the forbidden city looming in the distance, as you're forced to watch a public execution. The condemned, usually reserved for those guilty of treason, patricide, or other particularly egregious crimes, would be tied to a wooden frame in a seated position. The executioner, working with the precision of a surgeon, would begin removing small pieces of flesh from non-vital areas of the body: arms, legs, chest. Each cut was carefully placed to avoid causing immediate death. In fact, skilled executioners took pride in keeping the victim conscious and alive through hundreds of cuts. What makes Ling Chai particularly haunting isn't just its cruelty, but its ritualistic nature. The number and location of cuts followed specific protocols depending on the crime. Court physicians might be present to ensure the victim remained alive and aware, sometimes administering medicine to prevent blood loss or shock. Some historical accounts suggest the process could last for days, though most modern scholars believe these were likely exaggerations. Still, even a few hours of Ling Chai would feel like several lifetimes to the victim. Chinese history also gave us the notorious wooden horse, a triangular rack that victims would be forced to straddle. The sharp edge would cut into their groin as weights were attached to their feet, slowly splitting the body. Rather clever use of gravity, if we're being technical about it. Innovation isn't always something to admire. While China perfected the slow death, it was perhaps the Tang dynasty that introduced one of history's most elegant psychological tortures: sensory deprivation chambers. Prisoners would be placed in completely dark, silent rooms with nothing but their thoughts for company. They'd receive food and water at irregular intervals, disrupting any sense of time passing. The mind, it turns out, can create torments far worse than any physical pain when left to its own devices for too long. Modern research on solitary confinement suggests these ancient Chinese were onto something truly terrible. The brain simply isn't designed to function without sensory input. Speaking of psychological torment, let's take a ship across the East China Sea to Japan, where the ruling shogunates developed their own distinctive torture methodology. Japanese torture techniques were often designed not just to cause pain, but to violate the strict cultural codes of honor and cleanliness that governed Japanese society. Take, for example, the notorious torture tubs, or tsurushi, used during the Tokugawa shogunate. The victim would be tied in a half-standing position with their head inside a small wooden tub. Water would drip just a drop at a time onto their shaved head. The first hour was merely annoying. By the second, victims described it as maddening. After several hours, each drop felt like a hammer blow. The beauty of this method was that it left no marks while breaking even the strongest will. Merchants in medieval Nagasaki reportedly feared the water torture more than any physical pain. Japan also perfected the art of suspension torture. Onitsurushi involved hanging the victim upside down in a pit, often containing filth or even snakes. A small cut would be made on the forehead, causing blood to drip slowly toward the brain. The combination of inverted position, increasing pressure in the head from blood flow, and the psychological terror of being suspended over foulness created a uniquely comprehensive torment. To make matters worse, the victim might be kept this way for days, feeding them enough to keep them alive, but conscious through their ordeal. What's particularly noteworthy about Japanese torture is how it evolved alongside their martial culture. The same precise understanding of anatomy that made Japanese swordsmanship so lethal also informed their torture methods. They knew exactly where to apply pressure, where to cut, and how to maximize pain without causing death. The samurai class, those paragons of honor and discipline, weren't above using torture themselves. The practice of tsukubai, forcing a prisoner to kneel on jagged stones while answering questions, was a favorite for quick interrogations. If you've ever knelt on gravel for even a few minutes, imagine sharp stones cutting into your knees for hours while maintaining perfect posture, as any slumping would be met with a swift blow from a bamboo cane. Both Chinese and Japanese torture techniques shared something fascinating. They were often accompanied by elaborate bureaucratic documentation. The Qing dynasty maintained detailed records of torture sessions, including which techniques were used, how the victim responded, and what information was obtained. These weren't bloodthirsty barbarians. They were methodical civil servants doing their jobs. Somehow, that makes it all the more disturbing. In Korea, during the Joseon dynasty, torture took on yet another dimension. The famous leg screw torture, sujijiwa, involved placing the victim's legs between two bars and slowly driving wedges between them, crushing the bones incrementally. Unlike many Western torture methods, which often focused on threatening sensitive body parts for quick confessions, Eastern tortures generally assumed that breaking would take time. Patience was built into the process. Another notable Korean method was seokshul, where victims would have their fingers placed between sticks that were then bound tightly with rope and slowly tightened, crushing the joints. This was particularly effective against scholars and officials, as damaged hands meant they could no longer write, a devastating prospect in a culture where calligraphy was both art and status symbol. Throughout Asia, we also find evidence of the infamous bamboo torture, which may actually have some botanical truth behind the legend. Supposedly, victims would be suspended above shoots of living bamboo, which can grow several inches per day. The rapidly growing plant would slowly pierce the body from below. While historians debate whether this was widely practiced or more of a frightening folk tale, bamboo's remarkable growth rate does make the method theoretically possible. What makes Eastern torture methods particularly chilling isn't just their creativity, but their integration into otherwise sophisticated and enlightened societies. The same Chinese dynasty that produced exquisite poetry and philosophical treatises also refined techniques to maximize human suffering. The Japanese culture that gave us Zen gardens and haiku also gave us the tsurashi. These weren't aberrations. They were accepted components of justice systems that otherwise functioned with remarkable sophistication. As we drift eastward through history, keep in mind that these practices developed largely independently from Western methods. Different cultures, separated by vast distances, somehow arrived at similarly terrible conclusions about how to inflict suffering. Perhaps there's something universal in human cruelty, or perhaps just in human creativity, tragically misapplied. From the shadow of crumbling Rome emerged a new power that would dominate European life for a millennium, the Christian Church. And while Jesus may have preached love and forgiveness, his most fervent followers eventually decided that nothing says divine mercy quite like a pair of red-hot pincers. The medieval church's relationship with torture contains one of history's great ironies. Early Christians were themselves victims of Roman torture, with martyrs celebrated specifically for enduring horrific pain rather than renouncing their faith. Fast forward a few centuries, and the Church became Europe's most innovative architect of suffering, all in the name of saving souls. Of course, the transformation didn't happen overnight. For the first 1,000 years of Christianity, church law actually prohibited torture. Pope Nicholas I declared in the 9th century that confessions obtained through torture were invalid, a surprisingly progressive stance for the Dark Ages. But everything changed in 1252 when Pope Innocent V, a name that would prove tremendously ironic, issued the bull Ad Extirpanda, officially authorizing torture in cases of suspected heresy. Imagine yourself in 13th century Languedoc, southern France. The countryside is beautiful rolling vineyards, medieval villages clinging to hillsides, fields of lavender swaying in the breeze. It's also crawling with inquisitors hunting Cathars, a Christian sect with unfortunately different ideas about God. The papal authorities have decided these differences warrant correction through some rather persuasive methods. The infamous Spanish Inquisition, which nobody expects couldn't resist, wasn't actually the first Inquisition. That dubious honor belongs to the medieval Inquisition, established in the 1230s, but the Spanish version, established in 1478, certainly perfected the methodology. Under the leadership of Tomás de Torquemada, a name that has become synonymous with religious cruelty, the Spanish Inquisition developed torture into something approaching a perverted science. What made inquisitional torture particularly disturbing was its theological justification. This wasn't punishment for its own sake. It was about saving souls. The logic went something like this. Heresy damned the soul to eternal torment in hell. Temporary physical suffering that led to confession, recantation, and absolution was therefore an act of mercy. You're trading brief, earthly pain for eternal salvation. See, they were doing you a favor. The Inquisition's torture arsenal was diverse, but they particularly favored techniques that didn't draw blood. This wasn't out of mercy, but due to a convenient interpretation of the church law that clergy should not shed blood. Water torture, stress positions, and bone-crushing devices became preferred methods, allowing torturers to keep their hands technically blood-free while still inflicting unimaginable pain. The notorious strapado, which we mentioned briefly when discussing Roman methods, became the Inquisition's signature. The victim's hands were tied behind their back before they were hoisted by a rope attached to their wrists. The resulting dislocation of shoulders was excruciating enough, but inquisitors added their own twist, repeatedly dropping the victim partway through a controlled fall, causing additional trauma to the joints. Inquisition records show some victims endured dozens of these drops in a single session. Then there was the infamous Spanish boot, not footwear you'd want in your wardrobe. This diabolical device consisted of wooden boards placed around the leg, with wedges hammered between them to slowly crush the limb. Each strike of the mallet sent splinters of bone into surrounding tissue. What made this particularly effective was its incremental nature. The torturer could start gently and gradually increase pressure, giving the victim ample opportunity to cooperate before things got truly unbearable. Water torture, specifically the water cure, was another Inquisition favorite. The victim would be strapped to an inclined board, head lower than feet, with the nose and mouth covered by a cloth. Water would then be poured over the face, creating the sensation of drowning. Unlike modern waterboarding, yes, we're still doing versions of this stuff over 500 years later. Humans are nothing if not consistent. The medieval version often involved actually filling the stomach with water, creating intense pressure and pain beyond the psychological terror of suffocation. What's particularly notable about inquisitional torture is its bureaucracy. These weren't random acts of cruelty. They were carefully documented procedures. Inquisitors kept detailed records of interrogations, including which torture methods were employed, how the victim responded, and what confessions were obtained. Some registers survive to this day, giving historians uncomfortably detailed insights into the process. Scribes would note with detached precision how many turns of the rack were applied, or how many water pitchers were emptied onto a victim's face. The Inquisition even had manuals, literal torture instruction books. The most famous, the Directorium Inquisitorum, compiled by Nicholas Imerich in 1376, reads like a how-to guide for breaking human beings. It includes not just physical techniques, but psychological approaches, advising inquisitors on how to manipulate victims through false promises, threats to family members, and strategic use of sleep deprivation. Medieval psychological operations, if you will. Speaking of psychological torture, the Inquisition was particularly adept at creating anticipatory dread. Suspects might be shown the torture chamber and equipment before any physical pain was inflicted. Torturers would explain in detail what each device did and how it would be used. Many victims confessed immediately after this preview, without a single finger being laid on them. The mind, after all, can sometimes create worse scenarios than reality. Even the Inquisition's architecture was designed to maximize psychological impact. Torture chambers were typically located in basements or towers, isolated enough that screams wouldn't be heard publicly, but designed so that other prisoners could hear them. The long walk down spiral stairs to the chamber, the heavy door creaking open, the smell of fear and bodily fluids, the sight of bizarre implements hanging on walls, all carefully staged to break resistance before the physical torture even began. One particularly cruel innovation was the Judas chair, or chair of questioning, a seat covered in spikes where the victim would be seated and slowly lowered onto the spikes using a system of ropes. The placement of spikes was carefully calculated to avoid vital organs, ensuring a slow, agonizing experience rather than a merciful, quick death. Some versions were heated from below, adding burning to the penetrating pain. All this while calm inquisitors asked their questions and scribes recorded every word for posterity. Despite their reputation, the Spanish Inquisition actually had stricter procedural rules than many secular courts of the time. Torture could only be applied once, though once was creatively interpreted as one session that might last for days with breaks. A physician was often present to ensure the victim didn't die prematurely. Confessions had to be repeated without torture 24 hours later to be considered valid. These weren't humanitarian concerns, but practical ones. A dead heretic couldn't recant, confess, or implicate others. What's particularly fascinating about the Inquisition period is how it intertwined torture with salvation. Pain wasn't just about punishment or information extraction. It was part of a spiritual journey. Suffering was seen as potentially redemptive, not unlike Christ's suffering on the cross. This twisted theology created a framework where torturers could see themselves as doing God's work, helping purify souls through fire and pain. As the medieval period gave way to the Renaissance, the Church's monopoly on torture began to fade. Secular authorities started establishing their own specialized chambers and techniques, but the Inquisition's methodical approach, the documentation, the psychological manipulation, the careful calibration of suffering would influence European torture practices for centuries to come. Because if there's one thing humans are good at, it's learning from the worst of our history rather than the best. While the Church was busy saving souls through strategic application of excruciating pain, Europe's secular authorities weren't about to be outdone in the suffering department. From the late medieval period through through the Renaissance, Europe's castles and fortresses became home to specialized chambers where the art of torment reached new heights, or rather, new depths. Welcome to the tower dungeons and torture chambers of Gothic Europe, where nobility created architectural spaces specifically designed for extracting truth, exacting revenge, and generally making life extremely unpleasant for those who crossed them. Imagine yourself wandering the misty countryside of 14th century England. That imposing stone castle on the hill isn't just the local lord's residence. It's also home to a purpose-built chamber of horrors tucked away in its bowels. These weren't improvised spaces. They were carefully designed facilities, often located in towers or below ground level, with specific features to enhance their grim functionality. Tower dungeons offered several practical advantages for the discerning medieval torturer. Their height provided isolation, ensuring screams wouldn't disturb the castle's more genteel residents or alert the local population to exactly what was happening inside those stone walls. The spiral staircases, almost always designed to curve clockwise as you descended, gave defenders an advantage if prisoners attempted escape, and the thick walls provided natural soundproofing, allowing torturers to work without distraction. The infamous Tower of London, still standing today as one of Britain's most popular tourist attractions, housed some of England's most sophisticated torture facilities. The basement of the White Tower contained the Little Ease, a cell so small that prisoners couldn't stand up, lie down, or even sit comfortably. Forced to remain in a cramped, contorted position, victims would develop excruciating muscle cramps and joint pain over days or weeks. Sometimes the simplest tortures are the most effective. Just across the Channel, the French were developing their own architectural innovations in the art of suffering. The Château de Chinon in the Loire Valley housed the remarkably unpleasant oubliettes from the French oublier, meaning to forget. These were special cells accessed only through a trapdoor in the ceiling. Prisoners would be lowered into these bottle-shaped chambers, often with inward-sloping walls making escape impossible, and then simply forgotten. Some oubliettes had spikes on the floor, ensuring a quick, if painful, end. Others were simply bare chambers where victims slowly starved in darkness. The psychological torture of abandonment, combined with the physical suffering of starvation, made oubliettes particularly dreaded. The Germans, always ones for efficiency, created some of Europe's most sophisticated torture chambers. Nuremberg's medieval dungeons included specialized rooms for specific torture methods, almost like an assembly line of suffering. Most notorious was the Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, though modern historians debate whether this specific device was actually used or was a 19th century fabrication, combining various authentic torture elements. The concept was simple yet horrifying. A coffin-like container lined with iron spikes, positioned to pierce non-vital areas of the body when closed around the victim. Whether historically accurate or not, the Iron Maiden represents the calculated precision that characterized Germanic torture, pain carefully calibrated to maximize suffering while prolonging life. What truly distinguished tower dungeons from earlier torture spaces was their specialized equipment. These weren't just rooms where ad hoc cruelty took place. They were furnished with custom-built devices designed specifically for causing pain. Take the rack, perhaps the most iconic torture device of the era. This wooden frame would stretch victims until joints dislocated and limbs literally pulled apart. The mechanical advantage of the turning wheel allowed a single torturer to generate tremendous force. The distinct popping sound of ligaments tearing became a dreaded feature of dungeon interrogations. Some sophisticated racks included spiked rollers that would simultaneously lacerate the victim's back as they were stretched. Because why settle for just one type of agony when you can combine them? The breaking wheel, known in Germany as the Catherine wheel, represented another pinnacle of medieval torture engineering. The victim would be tied to a large wooden wheel and their limbs systematically broken with an iron hammer or bar. Once every bone was shattered, the still living victim might be threaded through the spokes of the wheel and displayed publicly. Some particularly unfortunate souls remained alive for days in this state, unable to move without excruciating pain, exposed to the elements and scavenging birds. In the more privacy-minded dungeons of Bohemia, the pair of anguish gained popularity. This insidious device was inserted into various orifices of the body, mouth, rectum, or vagina, and then slowly expanded via a screw mechanism, causing internal tearing and unimaginable pain. Different versions were calibrated for different body openings, showing a disturbing attention to anatomical detail. While these mechanical devices receive most of the historical attention, we shouldn't overlook the role of furniture in medieval torture. Special chairs covered in hundreds of spikes would have victims seated and then strapped down, with their own body weight driving the spikes into their flesh. These chairs weren't designed to kill quickly. The placement of spikes deliberately avoided vital organs. Some models included a fire box beneath the seat for additional discomfort. These chairs of torture became so iconic that decorative miniature versions were sometimes displayed in the main halls of castles as warnings to those considering crossing the Lord. Even the humble cage saw innovation during this period. The infamous gibbet, or hanging cage, was a simple iron frame shaped roughly to the human body. Prisoners would be locked inside and then suspended from a gibbet arm or castle wall, exposed to the elements and public ridicule. Death came slowly through dehydration, starvation, exposure, or simply being pecked apart by birds. Some towns kept bodies in these cages long after death as warnings, medieval crime, prevention through graphic demonstration. What's particularly fascinating about this era is the emergence of professional torturers, specialists who developed their craft with the same pride as any artisan. In larger urban centers across Europe, the position of torturer became a legitimate profession, sometimes passed down through families. These weren't shadowy figures, but licensed civil servants with specific training. In some German cities, executioner torturers even formed guilds with apprenticeship systems and trade secrets. Tower dungeons also introduced innovations in record keeping that would make any modern bureaucrat proud. Torture sessions were meticulously documented, with scribes noting the methods used, the victims' responses, and any confessions obtained. Some of these records survive today, providing historians with uncomfortably detailed accounts of interrogation procedures. The Rath House of Nuremberg still houses ledgers listing the expenses for maintaining torture equipment, everything from replacement ropes to oil for rusted mechanisms. The psychological aspects of tower dungeons were as carefully designed as their physical elements. Many featured antechambers where victims would wait, listening to the screams of those being tortured before them. Torture implements would be prominently displayed, allowing fear to build before any physical pain was inflicted. Some chambers had sloped floors and drainage systems specifically designed to channel away blood, practical features that also served to terrify new arrivals with evidence of previous sessions. What distinguished this era from earlier periods was the privacy of torture. While Roman torture had often been public spectacle, medieval tower torture was typically conducted behind thick stone walls. This wasn't necessarily humanitarian. It simply reflected a change in purpose. Torture was increasingly about information extraction rather than deterrence through public example. The exception, of course, was execution, which remained very much a public affair. The torture might happen in private, but the final punishment was a community event, often with festival-like atmosphere. Medieval weekend entertainment options were admittedly limited as European powers set sail across oceans in search of resources, converts, and glory. They packed more than just flags and Bibles in their hulls. Torture techniques, refined over centuries in continental dungeons, found themselves exported to new shores alongside gunpowder and smallpox. The age of exploration was simultaneously an age of exported suffering, colonial cruelties, societies that adapted old world methods to new world settings. Imagine yourself on the docks of 16th century Seville, watching ships prepare for their journey to the Americas. Among the supplies being loaded are familiar implements, thumb screws, branding irons, whips, tools of empire as essential as sextants and compasses, because controlling new territories required more than just military might. It required the systematic application of fear. The Spanish conquistadors, first to establish major colonial presence in the Americas, brought their Inquisition experience with them like a terrible inheritance. While searching relentlessly for gold, they simultaneously hunted for souls, often with the same brutal methodology. The infamous encomienda system, ostensibly created to protect indigenous peoples by placing them under Spanish guardianship, quickly devolved into a framework for systematic torture and exploitation. In the silver mines of Potosi, now in Bolivia, Spanish colonizers adapted European torture techniques to the specific goal of extracting labor rather than confessions. Indigenous workers were forced into the mines for months at a time, developing specialized torments for those who resisted or couldn't meet quotas. One particularly cruel innovation was the meta system, where workers would remain underground for such extended periods that their eyes would painfully adapt to darkness, making exposure to sunlight during brief breaks an additional torment. What's particularly disturbing about colonial torture is how it often appropriated local materials and knowledge. In the Caribbean, Spanish colonizers learned about local flora, discovering that the sticky sap of certain trees could be heated and dripped onto skin, causing exquisite pain and blistering while minimizing permanent damage. Traditional European torture, twisted through the botanical possibilities of the New World. The Portuguese, not to be outdone by their Iberian neighbors, established their own specialized torture systems. In Brazil, the slave colonies operated under the fearsome fator or overseer, armed with instruments specifically designed for controlling the enslaved population. They particularly favored the palmatoria, a wooden paddle with holes drilled through it that created suction and blisters when struck against palms or soles. Simple, portable, and devastatingly effective, the device became so ingrained in Brazilian culture that a modified version was still used in schools well into the 20th century, a colonial legacy embedded in educational discipline. In North America, the French and British empires each developed their own colonial torture methodologies. French fur traders in Canada sometimes adopted and modified Native American torture techniques, particularly in their ongoing conflicts with the Iroquois. The practice of running the gauntlet, forcing captives to run between two rows of people armed with sticks and clubs, became a common punishment in frontier settlements, blending indigenous practices with European sensibilities about public punishment. British colonizers in North America brought their own distinct torture traditions. The infamous witch trials of Salem employed many techniques imported directly from European witch-hunting manuals. Swimming suspected witches binding and throwing them into water to see if they floated guilty or sank innocent, but possibly drowned, crossed the Atlantic intact. So too did pressing, placing heavy stones on a victim's chest until they confessed or suffocated. When George Burroughs, a minister accused during the Salem trials, was subjected to pressing, witnesses recorded that his tongue was forced from his mouth by the pressure before he finally expired. Colonial justice was nothing if not thorough. What makes colonial torture particularly insidious was its racialized application. European powers developed dual systems of justice and punishment, one for colonizers, another for the colonized. Torture methods considered too extreme for use against Europeans were routinely employed against indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans. This dual standard was often explicitly codified in colonial law. The French Code Noir, governing treatment of enslaved people in their colonies, permitted punishments for slaves that would have been unthinkable for French citizens. Plantation slavery represents perhaps the most systematic application of torture in colonial settings. The whip became the iconic instrument of this system, not just any whip, but specialized versions designed specifically for controlling enslaved populations. The cat-o'-nine tails, used on Caribbean sugar plantations, featured multiple knotted cords, sometimes embedded with wire, designed to maximize tissue damage. Skilled overseer torturers knew precisely how many lashes would incapacitate without killing, preserving their human property while administering sufficient pain to ensure compliance. Beyond physical torture, colonial systems excelled at psychological torment. Family separation was weaponized, with the threat of selling family members to different owners hanging constantly over enslaved communities. Public torture served as performance and warning on southern plantations, forcing the entire enslaved community to watch punishments, created a theater of cruelty that magnified the psychological impact beyond the physical pain inflicted on individuals. Some colonial powers specialized in particular torture methodologies. The Dutch, establishing their presence in what is now Indonesia, developed drowning torture techniques that took advantage of their naval expertise. The waterlogging used in Batavia, modern Jakarta, involved forcing salt water into the victim's body through various orifices, creating intense internal pressure and pain. Dutch colonial records, because of course they kept meticulous records, show this technique was particularly favored for extracting information from suspected smugglers. The Portuguese in Goa, India, established the Inquisition in 1560, creating a tropical version of European torture chambers. The notorious Goa Inquisitions focused particularly on forced converts suspected of secretly practicing Hinduism or Islam. Unique to this setting was the use of spice-based torture, force-feeding victims concoctions of local peppers that caused internal burning sensations and respiratory distress. Again, European methods adapted to local resources. Colonial Australia, initially established as a penal colony, developed its own specialized tortures for controlling convict populations. The triangle, a wooden frame to which prisoners were tied for flogging, became emblematic of Australian colonial discipline. Unique to the Australian penal system was the psychological torture of isolation in a land impossibly distant from home, with no hope of return. For Irish political prisoners, in particular, the knowledge that they would never again see their homeland constituted a form of existential torture beyond any physical pain. What makes colonial torture particularly worth examining is its systematic nature. These weren't just incidents of cruelty, but institutional frameworks designed to maintain control through fear. The Portuguese in Angola, the British in India, the Spanish in the Philippines, each colonial power developed administrative structures where torture was not an aberration, but a standard operating procedure, complete with regulations, specialized personnel, and documentation requirements. The legacy of colonial torture extends well beyond the formal colonial period. Many post-colonial police forces and military organizations inherited these methods, sometimes maintaining them for decades after independence. The rubber hose, the water cure, stress positions, these techniques outlived the empires that introduced them, becoming embedded in security apparatuses around the world. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of colonial torture is how it was often justified through narratives of civilization and progress. Colonial officials didn't see themselves as implementing systems of cruelty, but rather as maintaining necessary order among less developed peoples. Torture was reframed as discipline, sometimes even as a form of education. The British civilizing mission in India could somehow encompass both building railways and authorizing flogging for minor infractions. This cognitive dissonance allowed colonial administrators to oversee systematic suffering while maintaining their self-image as agents of advancement. As the 18th century dawned across Europe, a new intellectual movement began to transform society. The age age of enlightenment championed reason, science, and human dignity. Philosophers like Voltaire and Beccaria argued eloquently against judicial torture. Montesquieu's Spirit of Laws condemned cruel punishments as ineffective and immoral. Surely, in this new era of rationality and rights, torture would finally fade into history's darker chapters. And yet, as with so many aspects of human progress, the reality proved considerably more complicated. The Enlightenment didn't end torture, it reimagined it. Welcome to one of history's great paradoxes, how the age of reason applied scientific method to the business of causing pain. Imagine yourself walking the elegant streets of 18th century Paris. Intellectual salons buzz with talk of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Scientific academies publish groundbreaking research on electricity, chemistry, and anatomy. And in the basements of government buildings, methodical men in good suits are applying that same empirical approach to determining exactly how much pain a human body can endure before breaking. The Enlightenment paradox manifested most clearly in the work of physicians who brought medical knowledge to the torture chamber. These weren't sadistic outliers, but respected professionals applying scientific principles to what they viewed as a necessary practice. Medical monitoring of torture sessions became standard in many European jurisdictions, with doctors present to ensure victims remained conscious and alive through their ordeal. They kept careful notes on pulse rates, respiration, and unconsciousness thresholds, creating perhaps the first adverse event documentation in medical history. In Prussia, Frederick the Great, usually considered an enlightened despot and correspondent of leading philosophers, commissioned research into more efficient interrogation methods. The resulting studies examined how sleep deprivation affected cognitive function, how various stress positions could cause maximum discomfort without permanent injury, and how sensory manipulation could break resistance. The reports read like scientific papers, complete with methodological discussions and data tables. Enlightened torture was nothing if not thorough. What makes this period particularly fascinating is how torture became medicalized. Rather than relying on traditions or intuition, interrogators began consulting anatomical texts to identify vulnerable points on the human body. The branches of the trigeminal nerve, pressure points along the spine, precise locations where nerves clustered close to the skin, all became targets for scientifically optimized pain. One French police manual from the 1760s includes detailed anatomical drawings alongside interrogation techniques, like a terrible textbook for applied suffering. The Enlightenment also brought statistical thinking to torture. Rather than viewing each interrogation as an isolated event, a authorities began aggregating data on which methods produced confessions most reliably and efficiently. The Habsburgs' administrative records show early attempts at what we might now call torture analytics, tracking which techniques worked on which types of prisoners, how long subjects typically resisted, and which approaches produced the most reliable information. The bureaucratization of cruelty reached new heights through this empirical approach, even as public torture and execution began declining in European capitals. A more clinical approach emerged behind closed doors. The notorious letters de cachet in pre-revolutionary France, sealed orders for imprisonment without trial, often led to interrogation sessions conducted with scientific precision. The Bastille, that symbol of ancient regime oppression, housed specially designed questioning rooms where pain could be administered gradually and with exacting control. Psychological torture saw particular advancement during this period. Enlightenment thinkers had newly sophisticated understandings of consciousness and perception, which they applied to breaking resistance without leaving marks. Sensory deprivation chambers manipulated light cycles to disrupt circadian rhythms, controlled sound environments. These techniques feel disturbingly modern, yet emerged during the same era that gave us constitutional democracy and human rights declarations. Perhaps nowhere was the Enlightenment paradox more evident than in the early American Republic. The same founding fathers who eloquently proclaimed that all men are created equal permitted and sometimes personally administered torture to enslaved people they owned. Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence and owner of over 600 enslaved persons throughout his life, kept meticulous records of productivity and punishment. At Monticello, the whippings he authorized were administered according to carefully calculated formulas, balancing offense severity, productivity impact, and long-term value preservation. Enlightenment rationality applied to human suffering with disturbing precision. The scientific approach to torture also manifested in new technologies. The development of galvanism, early understanding of electricity, quickly found applications in interrogation chambers. Luigi Galvani's groundbreaking work showing how electricity could stimulate animal muscle movement was almost immediately adapted by European police forces. By the early 19th century, primitive batteries were being used to deliver precisely controlled shocks during questioning. Science advancing the art of pain with methodical efficiency. What's particularly chilling about Enlightenment-era torture is its clinical nature. Earlier torture often had elements of rage, revenge, or religious fervor. This new approach was dispassionate, methodical torture as process rather than passion. Reports from this period describe interrogators consulting manuals mid-session, methodically methodically working through established protocols, documenting responses with scientific detachment, the torturer as technician rather than zealot. Military discipline systems incorporated these scientific advances with particular enthusiasm. The Prussian army under Frederick the Great developed precisely calibrated punishment regimens with specific numbers of lashes prescribed for each offense category. Medical officers would examine soldiers before punishment to determine their physical capacity to withstand the prescribed number. This wasn't mercy, but efficiency, ensuring the punishment could be completed without permanently damaging military assets. Naval powers like Britain and France applied similar thinking to shipboard discipline. The cat o' nine tails wasn't just randomly applied. Admiralty regulations specified precise procedures, including the number of lashes appropriate for various infractions. Ship surgeons monitored victims during these floggings, sometimes recommending pauses to prevent death, not out of compassion, but to ensure the full punishment could be administered. Some surgeons kept detailed records of how different sailors responded to flogging, creating informal databases of human pain thresholds. The Enlightenment's influence extended to torture chamber architecture. Earlier dungeons had been dark, damp spaces designed primarily for containment and intimidation. The new interrogation rooms were often well lit, ventilated, and carefully designed for specific functions. Some featured angled floors for drainage, acoustic treatments to manage sound, and specialized anchoring points for restraints. Form following function with terrible clarity. Even the language of torture changed during this period, adopting the neutral, technical terminology of science. Records from previous centuries described torture in emotional or moral terms, the pain inflicted, the cries of victims, the confessions extracted. Enlightenment-era documents instead refer to procedures, responses, and outcomes. This linguistic shift wasn't just stylistic. It reflected a fundamental reconceptualization of torture as process rather than punishment. The Enlightenment period also saw new theoretical justifications for torture. Rather than appealing to tradition or divine authority, proponents developed utilitarian arguments based on the greater good. The mathematical philosopher Jeremy Bentham, generally considered a progressive reformer, argued that while torture was regrettable, it could be justified when the suffering of one prevented greater suffering of many. This consequentialist framework provided intellectual cover for continued torture practices, even as public opposition grew. What makes this historical period particularly relevant today is how many modern torture methods trace their origins to Enlightenment-era innovations. Stress positions, sleep manipulation, sensory overload, or deprivation. These techniques feel contemporary, yet emerged from the systematic thinking of 18th century rationalists. When we encounter modern euphemisms like enhanced interrogation techniques, we're hearing echoes of Enlightenment attempts to sanitize torture through clinical language. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, the Industrial Revolution would bring new materials, new energy sources, and new mechanical possibilities to all aspects of human activity, including, inevitably, the infliction of suffering. The Industrial Revolution brought with it not just steam engines and textile mills, but an entire rethinking of how to mechanize and optimize the ancient art of torture. Remember those hand-cranked thumb screws we discussed? Imagine the same twisted minds who envisioned those devices suddenly being handed the mechanical advantage of gears, pistons, and precision engineering. You might think modern society had outgrown such barbarism, but you'd be giving us too much credit. The 19th century simply industrialized pain production with the same fervor it applied to cotton processing. Perhaps the most emblematic torture device of this era was the so-called treadwheel, installed in British prisons starting in 1818. Prisoners were forced to climb wooden steps on a massive paddle wheel for up to 6 hours a day. Doesn't sound terrible, you might think, until you realize this equated to climbing about 8,000 feet, more than halfway up Mount Everest, every single day. The wheel would turn under your weight, meaning you were essentially climbing an eternal staircase to nowhere. Worse still, the original purpose of powering mills or pumping water was quickly abandoned. The wheel was disconnected from any productive machinery, ensuring your labor was as meaningless as it was exhausting. Pure punitive exercise, industrialized for maximum efficiency. Across the Atlantic, American penitentiaries weren't to be outdone. The water cure became a prison standard, but forget any association with relaxing spa treatments. This particular cure involved restraining the prisoner and forcing gallons of water down their throat through a funnel and tube, causing the stomach to distend painfully. Then, guards would place a board across the prisoner's abdomen and stand on it, forcing the water back up. You'd experience simultaneous drowning and crushing sensations, all while your body fought between the reflex to swallow and the need to expel water. What's innovative here isn't the concept. Forced water consumption was an ancient technique, but the clinical precision with which it was administered within the supposedly reformed prison system. The Victorians, with their strange blend of prudishness and morbid fascination, developed specialized devices aimed particularly at preventing self-abuse among young men. Anti-masturbation devices like the Jugum penis used metal rings with internal spikes that would cause pain during arousal. For the truly unlucky, There were even alarm systems that would ring bells when certain physical responses occurred during sleep. Imagine trying to explain that particular midnight cacophony to your boarding school dormitory. The medicalization of torture was well underway, with these devices often prescribed by physicians with the same confidence they might recommend tonic water for malaria. Speaking of medicalization, the 19th century saw the rise of psychiatric institutions with their own specialized forms of torment, all in the name of therapeutic intervention. The tranquilizer chair, invented by Benjamin Rush, whose face, ironically, appeared on American Psychiatric Association literature until 2015, restrained patients completely for days at a time. The shower bath, in which patients were blasted with ice-cold water from heights of up to 20 feet, was considered a progressive treatment for various mental illnesses. You'd be strapped into a specialized chair, unable to move or shield yourself as the freezing water hammered your body with enough force to cause bruising and occasionally broken skin. All this administered by doctors who genuinely believed they were helping you. The road to hell, as they say, is paved with good intentions and apparently lined with innovative medical apparatus. The industrial approach to punishment extended beyond specialized devices to the very architecture of confinement. The panopticon design for prisons, conceived by philosopher Jeremy Bentham, created a surveillance system where all inmates could potentially be watched at all times without knowing when they were being observed. The psychological torment of constant potential observation was built into the very walls that contained you. Your cell would be arranged in a circle around a central watchtower with specially designed blinds, ensuring you could never tell if guards were watching. Eventually, you'd internalize the surveillance and police your own behavior, the perfect embodiment of efficient Victorian values applied to punishment. Even execution methods weren't immune to industrial improvement. The gallows, that ancient instrument of judicial killing, received various upgrades. The long drop method, developed in Britain, calculated the precise height needed for the drop based on the condemned's weight to ensure the neck broke cleanly rather than resulting in slow strangulation. You'd be weighed beforehand, and your death would be planned with the precision of an engineering project. The guillotine, though invented shortly before the Industrial Revolution, represented the same mindset, mechanical efficiency applied to killing, with calibrated weights and angled blades tested for optimal performance. The electrocution chair, first used in 1890, represented the pinnacle of industrialized suffering, harnessing the very force that powered the modern world to extinguish human life. Edison himself advocated for its adoption, partly to demonstrate the dangers of his rival Tesla's alternating current. The earliest models were crude experiments, often resulting in horrific scenes as technicians miscalculated voltages. You'd be strapped in, a metal skull cap attached to your freshly shaven head, electrode paste applied to reduce resistance, and then jolts of electricity would course through your body. Sometimes once wasn't enough, and witnesses would have to endure the spectacle of multiple attempts. Progress, Victorian style, colonial powers exported these industrialized techniques globally. Various European nations implemented mechanized flogging frames in their colonies, such as the dreaded triangle used by the British in Australia, which positioned prisoners precisely for maximum effect from each stroke of the whip. The measurements between posts, the height of restraints, the angle of the body, all calculated for optimal pain delivery. You'd be secured so precisely that the skin on your back would be pulled taut, ensuring each lash caused maximum damage with minimum effort from the flogger. Efficiency, after all, was the watchword of the industrial age. The industrial mindset even transformed torture into data and metrics. Prison administrators began keeping detailed records on punishments, measuring their effectiveness through charts and statistics. The human suffering behind those numbers became abstracted, much like factory output or railway timetables. Your agony would be recorded as data points in a ledger, your screams translated into notations about prisoner response and behavioral modification outcomes. The bureaucratization of cruelty may be the most chilling innovation of all. By the dawn of the 20th century, torture had undergone its own industrial revolution. It had become systematic, optimized, measured, and in many cases, hidden behind clinical terminology or concrete walls. Perhaps most disturbingly, it had been normalized within institutions, prisons, asylums, reformatories that supposedly represented modern civilization's more enlightened approach to social problems. The machinery of pain had simply moved indoors, away from the public squares of earlier eras and into specialized facilities with specialized equipment, operated by specialized personnel. And as the industrial age gave way to the technological one, these innovations would seem almost quaint compared to what totalitarian regimes of the 20th century would develop when they applied scientific principles to the ancient art of breaking human beings. But that, my drowsy friends, is where our journey will take us next, into the modern nightmares of psychological torment that make physical pain seem almost merciful by comparison. Remember how I mentioned earlier that the worst tortures often weren't those that broke the body, but those that shattered the spirit. Well, here we find ourselves faced with the most insidious examples of the 20th century's contribution to human suffering. The totalitarian regimes that defined much of the 1900s discovered something their predecessors had only intuited. The body has limits to what it can endure, but the mind's capacity for suffering is virtually boundless. Sleep deprivation, perfected by the Soviets during Stalin's Great Purge, could break prisoners more thoroughly than any rack or wheel. Interrogators would keep suspects awake for days, using bright lights, noise, forced standing, or simply shouting them awake the moment their eyelids drooped. You'd begin to hallucinate after 72 hours, your cognitive functions deteriorating until you'd sign any confession placed before you. Your brain, starved of its essential recovery mechanism, would literally begin to consume itself. And the beauty of it, from the torturer's perspective, not a single mark left on your body. The isolation techniques, refined by various intelligence agencies during the Cold War, took solitary confinement to scientific extremes. The CIA's infamous MK Ultra program experimented with sensory deprivation chambers where subjects floated in soundproof, light-proof tanks of body temperature salt water with no sensory input whatsoever. Your mind would quickly turn against itself. Most test subjects couldn't last more than a few hours before experiencing intense anxiety, hallucinations, and panic. You'd think being alone with your thoughts would be tolerable, but it turns out we're fundamentally social creatures, and complete sensory isolation quickly becomes unbearable. White torture, pioneered in Iran's Evin prison, took this concept further by placing prisoners in cells where everything — walls, floor, furniture, food, clothing — was completely white. Guards wore white padding over their shoes and would not speak. The constant light never varied in intensity. You'd lose all sense of time, space, and eventually self. Prisoners reported that their memories began to fade, as if their very identity was being bleached away along with all color and sound. Some would intentionally cut themselves just to see the red of their own blood, a desperate attempt to reintroduce color into their bleached existence. East Germany's Stasi elevated psychological warfare to an art form with their Sitzung program, a methodical destruction of a person's sense of self without physical violence. They would break into dissidents' homes and subtly rearrange furniture, replace tea with a different brand, or move personal items. They'd spread rumors among your friends and colleagues, ensuring relationships frayed under suspicion. They'd arrange professional failures and orchestrate small daily humiliations. The victim would appear increasingly paranoid to others while actually being under intensive surveillance. You'd begin to doubt your own sanity as your life mysteriously unraveled, never quite sure if you were losing your mind or being systematically targeted. North Korean prison camps perfected the destruction of human dignity through forced self-criticism sessions where prisoners had to confess imaginary crimes against the state with sufficient emotion and contrition. Failure meant punishment for the entire group, ensuring fellow prisoners became your most vigilant monitors. You'd find yourself desperately inventing crimes you couldn't possibly have committed, while simultaneously believing you must somehow be guilty. The genius of this system was that it forced you to participate in your own psychological destruction, your mind becoming both victim and weapon against itself. Even democratic nations weren't immune to developing psychological torture techniques. The 5 techniques used by British forces in Northern Ireland in the 1970s included wall standing, forcing detainees to maintain stress positions, hooding, subjection to noise, sleep deprivation, and food and drink deprivation. When combined, these seemingly mild procedures created profound disorientation and psychological trauma. You'd lose all sense of time and place, your world reduced to pain, exhaustion, and the desperate need for relief that would only come with cooperation. Music torture emerged as particularly insidious in the later 20th century. U.S. forces in Panama blasted heavy metal at General Noriega's compound in 1989 to drive him out. By the early 2000s, detainees in Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib were subjected to endless loops of children's songs, heavy metal, or culturally offensive music at deafening volumes. The human brain cannot filter out sound the way it can ignore other stimuli, making prolonged acoustic assault remarkably effective. Imagine Baby Shark or Metallica's Enter Sandman playing at concert volume for days without pause. The rhythm would infiltrate your heartbeat. The lyrics would colonize your thoughts until nothing remained of your own internal monologue. Psychological torture extended beyond government actions to experimental research. In the 1950s, McGill University's Donald Hebb conducted sensory deprivation experiments where volunteers wore goggles, earphones, and padded mittens to restrict sensory input. Most couldn't tolerate it for more than a few days before experiencing severe psychological distress, despite being well-fed, comfortable, and able to end the experiment at any time. Your brain, it turns out, would rather experience pain than nothing at all. Without external stimuli to process, your mind begins generating its own increasingly disturbing content. Perhaps most disturbing was the shift from torture as punishment or information extraction to torture as behavior modification. China's re-education programs during the Cultural Revolution forced intellectuals and dissidents to renounce their beliefs through a combination of public humiliation, forced labor, sleep deprivation, and group pressure, you'd eventually come to parrot party orthodoxy, not because you believed it, but because the alternative, maintaining your individual perspective, required more psychological strength than a broken human could muster. The goal wasn't your pain, but your transformation, which somehow feels more violating than mere physical suffering. The medical establishment provided disturbing contributions to psychological torture as well. Psychiatric abuses in the Soviet Union involved diagnosing political dissidents with sluggish schizophrenia and subjecting them to insulin shock therapy, drug regimens that induced permanent tremors and chemical restraints. The particular horror lay in the perversion of healing institutions into instruments of state control. You'd be told that your resistance to authority was itself evidence of your mental illness, creating an inescapable loop where any protest simply confirmed your diagnosis and justified further treatment. Water torture evolved beyond simple drowning simulations to refined psychological torment. Chinese water torture, allowing water to drip continuously onto a restrained victim's forehead, demonstrates how something as gentle as a water droplet can become excruciating through repetition. Each drop would land on exactly the same spot at irregular intervals that prevented you from anticipating the next one. The inconsistent timing created a particular form of mental anguish. You couldn't prepare yourself, couldn't build resistance through prediction. Your entire consciousness would eventually narrow to that single point on your forehead, waiting for the next drop to fall. Forced standing, seemingly simple compared to more elaborate tortures, proved remarkably effective when extended over time. Victims made to stand motionless for 18-20 hours would experience excruciating pain as fluids accumulated in their legs, causing massive swelling. Their weight, normally distributed through movement, would concentrate on the same small areas of cartilage and bone. You'd be threatened with punishment if you moved or fell, ensuring your own body became your torturer. The Vietnamese perfected this during the war, with American POWs reporting it as more unbearable than direct physical abuse. What makes 20th century psychological torture particularly disturbing is how it was developed with scientific precision. The CIA's 1963 KUBARK counterintelligence interrogation manual reads like a clinical psychology text, detailing exactly how to induce regression in subjects through sensory deprivation, alternated with sensory overload. The scientific approach created a veneer of legitimacy over practices designed explicitly to break human minds. You'd be processed through these techniques like a subject in a laboratory experiment. Your psychological disintegration observed and documented with clinical detachment. By the late 20th century, torture had evolved from a public spectacle of physical brutality to a hidden science of psychological destruction. The modern torturer might never raise a hand against you. They'd simply create conditions where your mind would torture itself. And perhaps that's the most sinister evolution of all in humanity's dark history of inflicting suffering upon itself. The realization that to truly break someone, you needn't touch their body at all. You need only carefully, methodically, scientifically dismantle their mind. We've traveled together from ancient torture chambers to modern psychological warfare, witnessing humanity's capacity for both extraordinary cruelty and remarkable resilience. Though these accounts may have disturbed you, there is something strangely comforting in knowing that most of these practices have been condemned by the march of civilization and human rights awareness. Your eyelids grow heavier now, your breathing deeper and more rhythmic. The horrors we've discussed belong to history, to scrolls and textbooks and distant memories, not to this quiet room where you rest, safe and unharmed. Feel the gentle weight of your blanket, the softness of your pillow, the peaceful stillness that surrounds you as you hover on the threshold between wakefulness and dreams. Allow these historical shadows to recede completely. Let your thoughts drift to kinder shores, to the countless acts of compassion that have also defined our human story. For every inventor of cruelty, there have been 1,000 defenders of dignity and kindness. So now, release these dark histories completely. Let your mind unburden itself, floating freely into the welcoming embrace of sleep. Tomorrow is unwritten, full of light and possibility, and tonight you need only surrender to peaceful dreams.